This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Raquel from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week, I'm joined by editor Michael Harte, whose recent work includes Still, a Michael J. Fox movie for Apple TV+. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good, thanks. I guess my first question for you is, how did you get involved with this documentary?
Oh, I had worked on a documentary called Three Identical Strangers about 5 years ago. I'm not sure if you saw it. And as we were making that...
I did. It was a great doc.
Oh, thank you. I'm not fishing for compliments.
No.
The first act of that documentary kind of feels, or the director at the time wanted it to feel like an 80s movie. And so we ended up watching a lot of Michael J. Fox movies to get the vibe of 80s films. And during that process, we thought, do you know what, he'd be an amazing person to make it about. So we contacted his agent and found out from the agent, they said, no, you're too late. David Guggenheim, the great director, has already started the process with Michael, and so game over. But then luckily he was looking for an editor, and my director at the time, Tim Wardle, who directed Three Identical Strangers, said to Davis, you should look into Michael. And not only is he a good editor, but he's a bit of a Back to the Future fanatic and loved Michael J. Fox stuff. So he knows the material. He may not know, the Michael J. Fox that you see in the documentary, but he knows his back catalogue pretty well. So I had a conversation with Davis, and we were off to the races from there,
I guess my first question for you is, did you guys transcribe every single Michael J. Fox film? Because I feel like you guys had little lines that you could drop in throughout from his films.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts when I look back now at the final product. I didn't realize what we were doing when we were doing it, but no, we didn't transcribe it. About halfway through the process, I knew we needed to look at everything. And so I asked Davis for time. I was in London editing, and he was in LA at the start of the process. So I said to him, look, I need about 7 weeks or 8 weeks to just get on top of his material and how much stuff that, there's a lot of stuff that I'd already gone through, archive of him being interviewed at different points in his life and his career. And we got some home movie footage. The audiobook's really helpful, but I remember as we were making it, I thought we need to look at his movies and his TV shows. The movies were actually pretty easy. I would watch them, and this is a really kind of boring editor thing, but I have the ability to put a marker if I see something in the edit. I'll just mark something. So if I see a close-up shot of Michael, I'll mark it and say close-up of Michael looking to the right at a newsstand. And I did that for about 6-7 weeks. The movies were easy. The movies were easy because there was less of them. But the Spin City and Family Ties was like, it would have taken me and my own months. So I got a couple of assistant editors in, and we had a really good archive producer as well, Jackie Cleary, who found everything. And I just went through the material. I do get obsessive about seeing everything in projects that I work on, and it kind of drives the directors insane because it takes a long time. But I always say this will pay off in the end if you give me the time to do it. So. But in this case, I had to have assistants to help me go through a lot of the material, but wasn't transcribed. It was just a matter. Sorry, there was a very long answer to your question, which is we didn't transcribe them. We just watched them all,
I grew up in a household in the projects in East Harlem. There's a program at WNET, the public television station, to get more people of color behind the camera, in the editing room, doing sound, writing scripts. When they put me in a dark room and they showed me how to use the splicer and the rewinds, I felt this big sigh of relief, this sense of, wow, I found my space. The editing part of filmmaking is the real nuts and bolts, what makes films come to life. You can ask Spielberg, you can ask Tarantino, you can ask Spike. When you sit here, this is where the proof is in the pudding. I'm Sam Pollard, and this is my class on documentary editing.
Well, I guess how much footage outside of the actual movies and shows did you guys have? Like interview and other interviews and his family home videos, that stuff.
It was a good amount. It wasn't massive. There wasn't a huge amount of home movie footage. There was a lot. We started with his audiobooks. That was the first place to start. We got really lucky on this project for two reasons. One, we had Michael's audiobooks as a starting point, because when I started the project, me and Davis sat in a room together, and there was nothing. The only thing we had was, let's make a documentary about Michael J. Fox, and he had expressed an interest to Davis that he wanted to do it too, and it was a blank piece of paper. And normally in an edit, I come on 80% into the process or 70%, but actually, I kind of hate the phrase post-production, because I don't think editing is post-production anymore. A lot of edits are starting way after the production. So we but we got very lucky, because the first place we went to was his audiobooks, and specifically Lucky Man, which is excellent. And what's great about them is that he read them. He read the audiobooks, so it's not some randomer just kind of reading his stuff. And also, he's a brilliant writer, and he's such a good storyteller in the audio. The book is brilliant. Lucky Man was my way in. It was one of the first things that kind of inspired me to think about a documentary. It's so well written, and it's funny, and it's very reflective of the documentary. You see, like, the tone of it, as we kind of wanted to. So, sorry, we started with his audiobooks, which is like 10 hours, 10, 12 hours, and then built an arc from there. And then I got that down to an hour and a half. And then after that, it was like, what archive have we got to illustrate the things he's talking about in his life? And I don't know, there's about maybe 150 hours of archive of him interviewed on different talk shows. And every time he released a movie, there was 10 interviews, and we'd use that kind of stuff, and behind the scenes footage. And I honestly, sorry, again, it's a long answer to your question, which is, I don't know how much footage, but we had a lot. It's endless.
Did you use the because he essentially, like, throughout what I assumed it was voiceover, but are you using clips from the book then for the voiceover parts, or did he come in and record that stuff?
Okay, so the process was, we started with his audiobooks. Yeah, a lot of the voiceover that you hear in the movie is him from the audiobook of Lucky Man, which I think he recorded around 2002, 2003. And his voice is great. And it kind of, I always loved the sound of his voice anyway in his movies, but in his audiobook, there's something about the tone of his voice, and it's almost playful. And so we used that as a starting point. And then we had not planned to shoot any interviews with Michael. We were going to do, or I was going to do, that was my idea, that we could just do this entirely through archive. We use his audiobooks, and then we build archive on top of that, or we use the archive from different points of his life to kind of illustrate the things he's talking about in his audiobook. Because the audiobook gave us a good arc, but there were gaps in his story that whoever had edited his book into audiobook form had cut out a lot of things.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it cut out things that we were annoyed about, and I just thought, well, we just won't go there. Maybe that guy's already done the job for us. One section on Teen Wolf, when he talks about putting his makeup on in Teen Wolf and saying things like, I had to eat my lunch through a straw. And I'd read it in the book, and I knew it was there, and I was like, that would be great. But in his audiobook, he hadn't recorded. So Davis's idea was, well, why don't we just go and see how he is now, and if he can record that stuff, or even talk about it in an interview. Let's just interview him and see how we go. We may only use the audio. So Davis went to New York and shot an interview with Michael. I was in LA at this point. Or sorry, I was in London. And he sent me his dailies, I think you call them in America, and his rushes, and told me to look at them. It was about a 4-hour interview. And I remember the first day I watched it, and I was completely blown away by it. It was just like, this is easily the best interview I've ever had in my edit, if not I've seen. It was just the way he told his story, and he's so present and so funny and witty, and you know, most of all, he's just honest and gave everything. And him and Davis had such good rapport. Once we had that, the game changed. It was like, okay, we've got two things now. We've got his interview in present day and his audiobooks. And the challenge for us then was, how do we edit those together? And that was the next phase, you know.
Yeah. Well, and because you also have the footage of him on New York streets, and it has one of my favorite parts is where he falls over.
It's amazing.
The woman goes to help him, and he's like, "You knocked me over," or like, I can't remember what his line is, but it's just
you knocked me off my feet.
Yeah, you knocked me off my feet. And I was just like, oh, so good, because it almost breaks the tension in the sense of like what he's dealing with.
Completely. And that's what Davis talked about this a lot, which is when people think about Michael J. Fox and the documentary that they're going to see, people still think about it now, those that haven't seen it. They are expecting a very sad documentary, or a very kind of, you know, this is very much about Parkinson's and that's it. And that section of the movie, when he wakes up in the morning until he falls over, is basically what the audience were expecting. Like, they were like, okay, so we gave them, just for a beat, this is what, you know, people expected to see in this movie. And then when he said that line, "You knocked me off my feet," he flips the tone of the film. To us, it was just, okay, now we can do what we want. Tonally, we can have fun. We can, because he's allowing us to, because that line just says everything about his character. And yeah, it's an amazing line. And it was basically the starting point for the tone of the documentary.
Well, and it's interesting because I remember seeing him in Curb Your Enthusiasm originally.
Yeah.
And then I saw the bit in it, but I feel like if you're not ready for it, you would take that out of context pretty easily.
Yeah.
No, I do want to know, like, that flicker with his finger, like he talks about sort of trying to explain the flickering. How did you guys come up with the sort of effect that you were doing? Like, who was it, an idea that you guys had before as you sort of came into the cutting room, or was it something that was discovered in the cutting room?
The pictures or the sound, or?
Well, he's talking about, he like holds up his hand and then his finger starts to flick and you get that sound of like the wings or something fluttering.
Yeah. The Moth Swing, I think he used to describe it as. Yeah, there's a few moments in the documentary / movie where we just didn't have the archive to tell the story. We didn't. We wanted this to be entirely from his point of view. That was really important. It was his chance to tell a story. And so I had built a lot of like I said, I used the audiobook as a starting point, and used a lot of archive then to kind of, I hate using the word picture up, but to kind of illustrate the things that were happening based on the things he said in the audiobook. But what we realized, and Davis saw this a mile off, he saw it way before I did, is that there isn't the archive to tell this story. It just doesn't exist. We're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to think of new ways to tell this story, to tell his story, and to keep it there. We could just put other pictures there, but what would happen every time I did it? You know, I'd use like archive of a moth just fluttering, but it was somewhere. It would push you out. It was never his POV, and that was the challenge from the start of the film, is how do we always keep the audience in his shoes? And the first scene is him in his room with looking at his hand. It's like, okay, so how do we do this? How do we tell this story? And Davis's answer initially it's very simple. It's like, well, let's recreate it ourselves. And so he shot it. We storyboarded it. We had a guy in Barcelona, a guy called David Navas, I was in London, Davis was in LA, and David Navas was in Barcelona. We'd find a window of time, maybe for an hour a day, once or twice a week, and we'd storyboard stuff, and he would do it in real time. So we would play him a piece of the audiobook, and then he would start to draw things, and Davis was excellent at it. I wasn't very good because I had my head in archive. And Davis would say, I want to see his hand move to the right. And so we then had a cut that had archive and storyboards, and it was an hour and a half, and his interview. So we had all that stuff in, but I always felt that there was something missing. So sorry, and then he would have got an actor to shoot some stuff. That was the plan. But as we were cutting it all the way through, I always felt that we were missing a piece, that there's something not right with it just felt slightly, just almost felt too easy, that we were doing the thing that a lot of people just do, which is like, let's just shoot recreations where we don't have archive. And because we'd watched so much of his, I'd watched so much of his movies, and I was so familiar with every shot in his back cat, basically. And look, I don't mean to be arrogant, but when in work, I can't remember anything. Like outside of work, I can't remember what I did yesterday, or I can't remember a magazine that I read 2 weeks ago or an article. But for some reason, when I'm in the edit, I can remember most shots. I can remember everything I've seen, and I have a search system in Avid. But as we would watch the cut, I would start to think about the shots that I'd seen in his face. I was like, well, my issue was that in the recreations, you're always looking at the back of his head because he's an actor. We can never show his face because there's an actor playing one of the most famous people in the world, and we just can never show his face. So for a lot of those recreations, we're always going to have to look at the back of someone's head, and it's going to push the audience out. So then my solution to that, I thought, well, what if we try and start to use clips from his movie and use his face to then cut to kind of place him at that period in his life in these scenes. And once we did that, what happened then was I would take a shot from something like Bright Lights, Big City, and he would be looking at something, and Davis then reworked the storyboards to match those movies. So then we went backwards. So then everything that he would storyboarded, we redid, you know, based on the movie clips that we used in the film, which kind of people seem to dig a bit, like, which is nice.
Well, and it's interesting because it's one of the few times where there was moments in the film where I'm like, am I watching a recreation or am I watching a clip from a film? Because it would happen so quickly that you're just like, wait a second, is that a person pretending to be Michael J. Fox or not?
Look, and you know, it was a real fun thing to work on, that trick, but it was always, I said to Davis, it always has to be in service of the story. At some point you could just get carried away and we do it for fun and make scenes because we can, but it always had to be in service of whatever story or whatever scene he was describing at the time. And the way in, I think one of the kind of best or the most effective examples of it was the first one that we did, which was when he's talking about Back to the Future and getting the script. And we had thought about storyboarding a guy getting a script and reading it, and I had a clip of Bright Lights, Big City where he's reading just a random piece of paper, and I thought, well, let's try that, and added that to the audiobook, and it kind of worked, and I was like, that's kind of interesting, that may work, but it just wasn't. Sometimes in the edit you get that kind of rush of excitement when something starts to work, and it was kind of. But what happened was I took the kind of motif, the musical motif from Back to the Future, and it kind of goes diddle in. When we added that to the scene, you had this audiobook picture, and that when those three things came together, it was like opening the door to another dimension. You know, I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be the thing. I sent it to Davis, and he woke up the next day and sent me an email and said, "This is us. We need to go for this and not be afraid of, you know, if it works or if it doesn't work. But this feels like something new and an interesting way, and it's reflective of Michael J. Fox, which he likes to play. He's very playful, and we get to do the same now. Like we get to play with movies, and also it's just, as I think somebody in the New York Times wrote, we're using Michael J. Fox movies to make a Michael J. Fox movie, and it's true. That's basically what we did, you know.
Yeah. What would you say was the most challenging scene to cut?
Oh, that's a good question. The first one's always hard. Yeah. It was the first and the last. It was the first scene and the last scene. The first scene was so hard because because we were never fully sure if the audience was going to take the leap with using archive in a different way. You can see in the film it becomes the technique becomes more and more confident as the film goes on, as we did with our method. But initially in that first act, or that first scene, there's a lot to get through. There was a lot, like he's waking up in his bed, his fingers flickering, and we have to establish who he is at the time as a character. You know, who's Michael J. You have to assume some people don't know, but people want to be refreshed as to who he is. And we've got to set up that he's a movie. There was a lot of things to set up there. And it's the top of the film, and you don't want to be doing too much exposition at the start. And I think that was a scene that we just kept going back. We kept, we would go off and we cut this. Second scene was flawless. It was such an easy thing to cut. It was so beautifully shot. And when he wakes up in his apartment and he walks and he leaves, and that's just like, there's very little editing to do there. It's just like, that's his space. And the present day stuff was really easy to cut because it was just purely the Michael J. Fox show. It was when I basically sat back. I used to love cutting those scenes because I knew I could go home early because they were so easy, because he just nailed it every time. And I would take the scene, and there was very few moments where we were recutting and taking notes, and we need to figure out how those scenes seemed to work on their first pass. But the scenes in the past, when we're using the archive in a different way, were all tricky in their own right. But the first one was really, we're kind of trying, how do we start a movie's hard, but how do we introduce the audience to this kind of grammar that we're trying to figure out ourselves, and that was why we just kept going back to it, and by the end we'd cracked it. And
now I gotta ask this: showing the film, like when you're working on a doc, showing it to the subject is always a stressful time when it's like sort of done. But then if you're also a fan of that subject, it sort of doubles up the stress. So what was it like showing him the cut? Were you there with him, or did you just get feedback afterwards?
I've been editing for about 20 years. I've been doing it since I was about 18 years old. I kind of started as soon as I left university. I just started using an edit. But to this day, I struggle to show anybody my cuts, even the directors I work with. I loved lockdown purely in for work because I didn't have to be in a room with, and I would just send them quick times. I to this day struggle to show people in a room. I hate viewings. I don't like it. It's just more reflective of me than anything. Anyway, and Davis, he understood that too, but his method was the complete opposite, which is we show people all the time. Every week we'll have a screening. Every week. He loved it, and it was hugely beneficial. I learned so much from those screenings, and the film became better and better because of it. And in my world, I would just go into a room, I would cut for 6 months, and then finish, show a product, and that's not how it works, and it doesn't really work. But I've watched Michael J. Fox films since I was about 4 or 5 years old, and you know what he's like. He's one of the greatest actors of all time, and has become one of the greatest people of all time through his work with his foundation. And so the idea of showing him a cut to me was like, to the point I was like, I don't think I can be there. I remember saying to Davis, I'm not sure. It doesn't matter if I'm there or not. Davis, like, you have to be at the screening. And I had never met him before. I had 1 or 2 Zooms. But Davis did the talking, and I kind of went very quiet and just listened and tried to not say the wrong thing. We were in LA, and we had a rough cut of the film, which I thought was kind of working, but there's loads of work to do. We'd only been in it for like 10 weeks or 12 weeks. But he then showed up with Tracy and his son and a few other people to watch it. And like the most terrifying thing that I'm just like, this is kind of carnage, and I'm presenting to him, here's what I consider as an hour and a half of your life, and I'm sorry for all the stuff that I cut out and don't think was relevant. And but what was amazing is he is exactly as you expect him to be, and more, and was so he was really complimentary first, and was very much in favor of giving the filmmakers a license to to make the movie. Even after he'd seen the cut, he had a few suggestions which were really good ideas and really strong. He had a really good sense of timing and narrative, and his comic timing's brilliant. He knew when the jokes were outstaying their welcome, and he suggested a few things, and so it was great. And he's worked with amazing directors and made amazing films, and I'm not comparing our work to those directors such as De Palma and Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis and Peter Jackson. He's worked with these people, so he knows how to make a movie. So actually, once I got past that, it was so beneficial to have him in the edit when he could and when he had the time to watch a cut. And Tracy as well, she had suggestions, and they were all great. And it actually really helped. Even once I got past the fear of it, it was great.
Well, it blew me away in the doc when they said his comic in Family Ties. They were like, "Oh, we don't think he has the comic timing," which was
I know.
blowing after, like, especially when you see like when he says when he wins the Emmy and he's like, "I feel 4 feet tall" or whatever he says.
Brilliant.
Right? But you can see he's got it locked and loaded, and he's just waiting for everyone to calm down so he can put in the joke. Like, it's just timed so perfectly.
Well, I did a screening in London. The guys couldn't be there, and we had a premiere in LA that was cancelled. So I did a mini premiere in London for all my friends and family and random cinema ticket buyers. And I took a joke. I wanted to say something funny at the start of the screening. And I took a joke that he made about. I don't even want to repeat it because I said the joke at the start of the premiere and nobody laughed. And it was the exact same joke. And I was like, okay, it's about timing. It's about comic timing. And you cannot take Michael J. Fox's material and fob it off as your own. There's a magic to the way he delivers it that I just don't have. And I figured it out. So I learned the hard way at the premiere.
Well, my last question for you, what would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch? And I would add an addendum to that. What's your favorite Michael J. Fox project other than yours?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I mean, I could show you about Back to the Future. I have a Back to the Future poster framed in my hallway, and it's I don't know if it's a guilty pleasure because I have no guilt about loving Back to the Future because I think it's kind of flawless. I mean, as a guilty pleasure, definitely something from the 80s, like Inner Space, you know. Yeah. I watch that every so often, and it's so good. And I'm a huge Joe Dante fan. Yeah. My favorite Michael J. Fox project is, without a doubt, Back to the Future. And, Back to the Future 2.
Which one of the three? Is it always the first one, or?
I was obsessed with the second one when I was young, and it was the first movie I saw in the cinema. And I hadn't seen the first one. I was like 6 or 7, and I remember going in. I had no idea what was happening because I hadn't seen the first, and it's so integral to the story of the second. But I was completely mesmerized, and it was just like the future seemed like it was real. I thought I could kind of reach out and grab the hoverboard, and went home and wrote to Santa that night and said, "I want a hoverboard for Christmas."
I wonder how many kids wrote asking for a hoverboard.
And you know what? And the truth is, then I got one. Like 20 years later, I found one on eBay, and I bought one. But I think the first is flawless when I watch it, and it's just I watch it every couple of months, and it gets better. It's going to be better. I haven't watched it since we made this, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, as a kid, I loved the third one just because it was like so different from the first two. Like, it obviously isn't as popular as the first one, but
yeah, and I think it's because it's a Western and it has less, you can have less fun with it because there's no hoverboards, or the DeLorean isn't in it as much. But actually, the third one, the script is so tight and so well written, and everything kind of pays off. And a lot of the things that are happening in the second, they're limited what they can do because they're coming off 1 and 2. But it's really good, and the older I get, the more I enjoy it.
Yeah, well, and they shot 2 and 3 at the same time, so they're sort of locked
in. It's completely insane.
Yeah.
I don't know how they did it, but I remember that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Hey, no problem.
And that's it for our show. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course on Twitter at filmmaker_you. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to AJA.com for all your production and post-production needs.